Every human civilization that has ever existed believed in something it could not prove. Every single one. No exceptions. Hunter-gatherers living in caves painted gods on the walls. Nomads who left no cities and no writing left burial sites packed with offerings for a world they had never seen. Civilizations that had never made contact with each other, separated by oceans, by continents, by thousands of years, all independently developed priests, rituals, sacred places, and stories about where the world came from and what happens after you die. That is not coincidence. That is not primitive thinking that advanced people eventually grew out of. That is a feature of the human mind so deep, so consistent across time and culture that you have to take it seriously as a fact about our species, whatever you personally believe about whether any of it is true. Now here is the second thing, and this is where it gets complicated. Every religion in history has also been used as a tool to justify conquest, to concentrate power, to determine who eats and who starves, who rules and who obeys, whose death is a tragedy and whose is a necessary sacrifice. The same belief systems that gave people comfort in the face of suffering were used by other people to cause the suffering in the first place. This is not a video about whether God exists. That question is above my pay grade and probably yours too. This is a video about where religion comes from, how it spread, how it changed, and who has been in charge of the answers to those questions throughout human history. The story starts before writing, before cities, before agriculture. It starts with a grave. The oldest evidence of religious behavior is not a temple. It is not a text. It is not an idol or an altar or a carved deity. It is a hole in the ground with a body in it, and someone put flowers there. In the Shenidar cave in what is now northern Iraq, archaeologists found a Neanderthal burial site dating to approximately 60,000 years ago. The bones were arranged with apparent care. Analysis of the soil around the remains found pollen from multiple flowering plants. Enough that the original excavator, Ralph Solecki, proposed that someone had placed flowers with the dead. Later researchers disputed the flowers, suggesting the pollen may have arrived by other means. The debate has not been resolved. But here is what is not disputed. The body was placed deliberately. The position was intentional. Someone took time, in a life that was brutal and short and mostly consumed by survival, to do something careful with a person who could no longer help them in any practical way. That is the seed of religion, not theology, not doctrine, not the elaborate institutional machinery that would come later. Just, this person mattered, and something about that mattering does not end when the breathing stops. By 40,000 years ago, the period of the cave paintings in Chauvet and Lascaux and dozens of other sites across Europe and elsewhere, something had shifted in how humans engaged with the world around them. The paintings are not merely representational. They are not hunting manuals or cattle counts. They show animals in movement, overlaid images, handprints pressed into the rock, and in some cases figures that are part human and part animal, what archaeologists call therianthropes. These hybrid beings appear across prehistoric art on multiple continents created by people who had never met each other. They are the oldest image of something that is not quite of this world, the first supernatural figure. Cognitive scientist Pascal Boyer and others have argued that religion emerges from specific features of the human brain, particularly our tendency to infer agency in ambiguous situations. The rustle in the grass might be a predator. The human brain evolved to assume yes first and investigate second, because the cost of being wrong in the cautious direction is much lower than the cost of being wrong in the reckless direction. That hair trigger agency detection system, applied to lightning, to disease, to death, to the behavior of animals, to the movement of stars, produces something that looks a great deal like a world populated by invisible intentional forces. You are not wrong to notice that this sounds like gods. Shamanism. The practice of a specialist who mediates between the ordinary world and the spirit world appears to be the oldest religious system for which we have evidence. It has been documented on every inhabited continent in cultures with no historical connection to each other. The shaman enters an altered state, typically through drumming, fasting, or plant-based compounds, and returns with knowledge or healing from the other side. The specific cosmology differs by culture. The structure is so consistent, it seems to be written into the operating system. The first religious specialists were not priests administering a bureaucracy. They were people who went somewhere the rest of the community could not go, and came back with something the community needed. That distinction between the person who accesses the sacred and the institution that controls access to it is one of the most consequential faults in human history. We have been arguing over it for 60,000 years. Around 12,000 years ago, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, someone built the world's oldest known temple. Not a city, not a settlement, a temple. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture, it predates pottery, it predates the wheel. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers, which means they were not yet sedentary. They moved seasonally, they did not farm, and they did not live in fixed communities. And yet they organized the labor required to quarry, transport, and erect massive limestone pillars carved with animals, abstract symbols, and human-like figures in a structure that took generations to build. The standard model of how civilization developed assumed that agriculture came first, that people settled down to farm, and settlement eventually produced surplus, and surplus produced enough leisure to build temples. Göbekli Tepe inverts that entirely. The temple was there first, which suggests that the impulse to build a sacred place did not emerge from abundance. It may have driven the development of the systems that produced abundance. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavations for decades, put it simply: first came the temple, then the city. When agriculture did arrive and cities began to form in Mesopotamia around 5000 BC, religion did not merely accompany the process. It organized it. The first cities were not governed by kings in the way we imagine. They were governed by temples. The ziggurat, the massive stepped pyramid that dominated every Sumerian city, was not merely a place of worship. It was the administrative center, the granary, the court, and the bank. The priests who served the gods also controlled the food supply, adjudicated disputes, and managed the city's economic relationships with other cities. In the earliest Sumerian records, the city does not belong to the king. It belongs to the god. The king is the god's steward. A manager, not an owner. The divine is the ultimate landlord. This is not a metaphor. It was the literal legal structure. Land was deeded to temples. Laborers worked for temple estates. The surplus that made civilization possible flowed through religious institutions. The gods of early Mesopotamia were not remote abstractions. They were specific, practical, local. Enlil, the god of wind and air, was patron of Nippur. Inanna, goddess of love and war, was the divine owner of Uruk. Each city had its god, and each god had preferences, requirements, moods, and needs that had to be managed by professional staff. The priesthood was a civil service. What this arrangement produced was a concentration of power that had never existed before in human history. If the priests speak for the gods, and the gods own everything, then questioning the priests is not political dissent. It is cosmic defiance. The theological claim and the political claim become indistinguishable from each other, and that indistinguishability is, in fact, the point. The marriage of religion and state power is often described as a corruption of religion, something pure that got dirtied by political contact. The historical record suggests the opposite. They were born together, they grew up in the same house, and separating them, when people eventually tried, turned out to be one of the hardest things any civilization has ever attempted. Between roughly 800 BC and 200 BC, something happened across the civilized world that historians still struggle to fully explain. In China, Confucius and Laozi were developing entirely new frameworks for how humans should live and relate to each other. In India, the authors of the Upanishads were radically reinterpreting the Vedic tradition, and a prince named Siddhartha Gautama was working out what would become Buddhism. In Persia, Zoroaster was reforming Iranian religion into the first major dualistic theology, a cosmic war between good and evil that would echo through every Abrahamic religion that followed. In ancient Israel, the Hebrew prophets were insisting that their God was not one God among many but the only God, and that this God cared more about justice than about sacrifice. In Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were subjecting every inherited assumption about the cosmos and human life to systematic rational scrutiny. None of these people knew about each other. The distances involved were enormous. The cultural contexts were entirely different. And yet, across all of them, in the same few centuries, a recognizable shift occurred. Humans started turning the analytical lens back on religion itself, asking not just what the gods want, but whether the gods as currently described made any sense. Asking not just how to perform a ritual, but what the ritual was actually for. Philosopher Karl Jaspers, who named this period the Axial Age in 1949, argued that it represented a kind of second birth of human consciousness, a moment when humanity stepped back from its own inherited worldview and started examining it from the outside. Why it happened in multiple places simultaneously is still debated. Some scholars point to economic disruption, some to urbanization and the social complexity it produces, some to the technology of writing, which allows ideas to be examined and critiqued in ways that oral tradition does not permit. What is clear is what it produced. In India, the Upanishadic thinkers rejected the older Vedic system's emphasis on ritual sacrifice and priestly mediation, arguing that the ultimate reality, Brahman, was accessible directly through meditation and understanding, not through the services of a professional class. The Buddha went further, stripping the inquiry down to bare essentials. Suffering exists, it has a cause, the cause can be addressed, here is the path. No gods required, no priests required, no cosmological machinery required. A technology of the mind, transferable to anyone. In China, Confucius was equally uninterested in the metaphysical and equally focused on the practical, not what the gods want, but what a good society requires. Proper relationships, correct behavior, the cultivation of virtue as a civic project. The Tao Te Ching went further still, pointing towards something so fundamental it cannot be named. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, and suggesting that the path to alignment with ultimate reality was not more effort, more ritual, more doctrine, but less. In Greece, Socrates was executed in 39 BC for impiety and corrupting the youth, which in practice meant asking uncomfortable questions about what the city's gods actually represented and whether Athenians were living by the values they claimed to hold. He did not write anything down. His student Plato wrote down what he remembered, and those texts became the foundation on which most subsequent Western philosophy, and by extension, Western theology, was built. The Axial Age did not end institutional religion. In most cases, it got absorbed into it. Buddhism became a massive ecclesiastical organization with temples, hierarchies, and political entanglements. Confucianism became the official ideology of the Chinese imperial state. Platonic philosophy became the intellectual framework within which Christian theology was formulated. The questions got asked. The existing power structures found ways to supply the answers. But something had changed permanently. Once you have asked whether the inherited story is true, you cannot fully unask it. The Axial Age put a crack in the wall between belief and examination that has been widening ever since. In the ancient Near East, polytheism was not merely a religious preference. It was the logical consequence of political reality. If your city had a god and the neighboring city had a different god, and both cities had armies, then the outcome of battles told you something about whose god was more powerful. The divine landscape was a mirror of the political one. Multiple competing powers, negotiable loyalties, a hierarchy that could be disrupted by events. The idea that there was only one god, that the divine was not a hierarchy but a singularity, and that this singularity had chosen a particular people as its own, was genuinely radical. It did not emerge fully formed. Scholars trace it through a long process of development in ancient Israel, from early texts that treat other gods as real but inferior to Yahweh, to later texts deny the existence of other gods entirely. The full monotheism that most people think of as the original form of the tradition was actually the destination of a centuries-long theological argument. What monotheism did, and this is crucial, was eliminate the theological justification for pluralism. In a polytheistic world, the fact that different peoples worshipped different gods was not a problem. That was just how the divine worked. In a monotheistic world, if there is only one true God and that God has specific requirements, then everyone else is not merely different. They are wrong. And being wrong, in the eyes of a God who created the universe, is a condition that demands correction. Judaism developed the monotheistic idea, but retained, for most of its history, the sense that this particular God's relationship was primarily with a particular people. The universalizing pressure was contained. The covenant was specific. Christianity broke that container. The message of Paul, who spread the Jesus movement across the Roman world in the decades after the crucifixion, was that the covenant was no longer exclusive. Anyone, regardless of ethnicity or legal status, could be included. This was theologically revolutionary and sociologically explosive. Within 3 centuries, a movement that had started as a Jewish sect in a Roman province had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The mechanism by which that happened is one of the most debated topics in religious history. Constantine's conversion in 312 AD is the standard landmark, the moment when imperial patronage shifted from the traditional Roman pantheon to Christianity. But Constantine did not simply impose Christianity. He promoted it, funded it, presided over its internal councils, and made it advantageous to be Christian in ways that it had recently been dangerous to be. The religion's subsequent growth tells you something about the relationship between sincere belief and institutional incentive, though historians disagree sharply about the proportions. Islam emerged in the 7th century AD in the Arabian Peninsula, and its speed of expansion was unlike anything that had come before it. Within a century of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Islamic rule extended from Spain to Central Asia. This was not purely military conquest. Large portions of the population in conquered territories converted voluntarily, sometimes quickly, sometimes across generations. The appeal was partly theological, partly egalitarian. Islam offered a vision of the community of believers that cut across tribal and ethnic lines in ways that other political arrangements of the era did not, and partly practical. In many cases, the Islamic administration was more competent and less extractive than what it replaced. What the three Abrahamic religions collectively accomplished was the installation of monotheism as the default assumption of roughly half the world's population, an assumption so thoroughly naturalized that many people in those traditions find polytheism conceptually strange, as if it were obviously a more primitive form rather than a different and equally sophisticated one. That naturalization did not happen through pure persuasion. It happened through persuasion, institutional power, legal coercion, military conquest, and the gradual disappearance of alternatives. The last temple of the traditional Greek religion closed in the 6th century AD. The indigenous religious systems of most of Europe, the Americas, sub-Saharan Africa, and large portions of Asia were suppressed, destroyed, driven underground, or survived only by disguising themselves as Christian or Islamic practice. The diversity of the religious landscape that had characterized the ancient world was narrowed into something far more uniform. That narrowing was not inevitable. It was chosen, enforced, and paid for. There is a pattern in the history of religions that repeats so consistently it starts to look like a law of nature. A founder or a prophet, typically poor, typically outside the existing power structure, typically critical of institutional religion, articulates a vision of direct access to the sacred, of human equality before the divine, of religion stripped back to its essential moral core. The vision spreads. It attracts followers who are hungry for exactly that directness and equality. It grows. And then, if it survives long enough and grows large enough, it becomes an institution. And institutions do what institutions do. They develop hierarchies, they accumulate property, they establish the boundaries of correct belief, and they develop mechanisms for enforcing those boundaries. The direct access to the sacred that the founder promised gets mediated again by professional specialists. The critique of power that animated the original movement gets co-opted by the new power structure that has grown up around it. Jesus of Nazareth preached in the temple courts and drove out the money changers. Within 3 centuries, the institution that bore his name was holding church councils with imperial backing to determine the correct doctrine and expelling those who disagreed. The Buddha left a palace to sit under a tree. Within centuries, Buddhist monasteries in some parts of Asia had accumulated so much land and wealth that they functioned as feudal lords. Muhammad received revelations insisting on the absolute equality of believers before God. Within decades of his death, his successors were fighting wars over succession in ways that have produced divisions, Sunni and Shia, that persist to this day. This is not a cynical observation. It is a structural one. The same thing happens in secular ideologies. The French Revolution's liberty, equality, fraternity produced the terror. The Marxist critique of class power produced Stalinist bureaucracies. The pattern is not about religion specifically. It is about what happens when any movement built around a transformative idea gains enough power to defend its gains, and discovers that defending gains requires exactly the kind of institutional machinery the original idea was criticizing. The Crusades are the most visible example in Western consciousness of religion weaponized for political purposes. But the Crusades were not an aberration. They were the expression of a structure that had been building since Constantine. The Pope could call armies into existence. The theological framework for holy war, developed by Augustine, elaborated by later theologians, provided the justification. The economic and political motivations of European nobility provided the material engine. The result was a series of military campaigns, beginning in 1095, that killed hundreds of thousands of people and created enmities that shaped the political geography of the world for centuries. The Inquisitions, Spanish, Roman, medieval, were mechanisms of religious conformity that functioned as instruments of political control. Accuse someone of heresy and you can seize their property, remove them from positions of power, and silence dissent with the full blessing of divine authority. The theological justification was sincere for many of the people administering it. The political utility was not coincidental. In India, the caste system, which emerged from the Vedic social order and was elaborated over centuries into one of the most rigid hierarchies in human history, was underwritten by religious cosmology. You are born into a caste because of your actions in a previous life. The hierarchy is not human injustice. It is cosmic justice already adjudicated. This framing made the system both psychologically coherent and extraordinarily difficult to challenge, because challenging it required challenging the entire cosmological framework in which it was embedded. None of this means religion is uniquely corrupting. Power corrupts the vessels that hold it, regardless of what those vessels are made of. What it means is that religion, because of its unique authority, because it speaks in the name of what is ultimately real, is an especially potent vessel. The institutions that claim divine sanction claim something no secular institution can, not just legal authority, but cosmic legitimacy. And cosmic legitimacy, historically, has covered an extraordinary range of human behavior. On October 31, 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed a list of 95 complaints to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Or he sent them by letter, or both. The precise mechanics are debated by historians with the intensity usually reserved for things that actually matter, which suggests that to the historians it does. What Luther was objecting to was the sale of indulgences. The Catholic Church's practice of selling certificates that reduced the time a soul would spend in purgatory. The theology behind indulgences was baroque, and the business behind them was straightforward. The Church needed money, and the fear of purgatory was a reliable revenue stream. The specific sale that triggered Luther's complaint was being used to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which remains one of the most expensive buildings in human history and still stands there, in case you want to see what a Reformation looks like in stone. Luther's protest was not the first. Jan Hus had said many of the same things a century earlier and been burned at the stake for it. What was different in 1517 was the printing press. Gutenberg had introduced movable type to Europe around 1440. By 1517 there were printing presses across the continent. Luther's theses, translated from Latin into German and printed in their thousands, reached an audience that no previous reformer had been able to reach. An audience of literate laypeople who could read the arguments themselves, evaluate them, and respond. The Reformation fractured Western Christianity permanently. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, Anabaptism, the major traditions that emerged in the 16th century, were followed by hundreds of further splits and denominations across the subsequent centuries. The logic of the Reformation, that the individual conscience, guided by Scripture, was a sufficient authority for religious truth, contained within it a principle that could not stop at Luther's particular conclusions. If you can challenge Rome, someone can challenge Luther. If Scripture is the authority, everyone who can read Scripture has access to the authority. The fracturing was not a bug. It was the inevitable consequence of the feature. The religious wars that followed the Reformation, the French Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War, a century and a half of intermittent catastrophe across Europe, killed millions and produced a political landscape so exhausted by theological conflict that by the late 17th century, European thinkers were actively looking for a framework that did not require everyone to agree about God. That framework became the Enlightenment, and out of the Enlightenment came the secular state. The separation of church and state was not a philosophical idea that got implemented. It was a political solution to a problem of violence. After a century and a half of wars in which people killed each other with sincere theological conviction, the people who survived decided that maybe the state should be neutral on questions that generated that level of disagreement. The First Amendment to the American Constitution was written by people who had just lived through the consequences of state religion. The wall they built was not theoretical, it was practical. Islam underwent its own reform movements. The Mutazilites in the 9th century argued for rational theology. Sufism developed as a mystical current that emphasized direct experience over institutional compliance, and the Wahhabist movement of the 18th century pushed in the opposite direction toward austere literalism. The tensions between those currents have not been resolved, and they are playing out in contemporary politics in ways that are immediately recognizable to anyone paying attention. In India, the Bhakti and Sufi movements of the medieval period emphasized devotion and direct access to the divine across caste lines. In some cases, they produced extraordinary cross-religious synthesis. In others, they were absorbed into the existing hierarchies. The colonial period introduced another variable. Western categories of religion, imported with the British administration, imposed frameworks of theology, scripture, and institutional identity onto traditions that had been organized differently, and produced modern Hinduism partly as a defensive response to being classified and defined by outsiders. Every major tradition has had its version of this argument, between the direct and the mediated, between the institutional and the personal, between the inherited form and the living experience. The argument does not end. It is, perhaps, constitutive of religion itself, the permanent tension between the moment of encounter with whatever is ultimate and the human need to organize that encounter into something that survives the person who first had it. At some point in the 19th century, European scholars decided that the world's religious traditions could be organized into a list. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Taoism, Shinto. The world religions were taxonomized, defined, founding dates and founding texts and clear boundaries, and installed into academic curricula where they remain today. The problem is that this taxonomy was invented. Not the religions themselves, those existed, but the way they were defined, bounded, and compared was a scholarly construction built on assumptions that reflected the specific tradition doing the constructing. The category of religion as a discrete domain of human life, separate from politics, from economics, from law, from everyday social practice, is itself a product of the post-Reformation Western world. The separation of church and state required, conceptually, that religion be separable from the rest of life. That separation was not available in most of the traditions being studied. In traditional Chinese culture, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism were not three competing religions that a person chose between. They were three different registers of the same life, used for different purposes. In indigenous traditions across the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific, there was frequently no word that translated to religion because there was no conceptual category that separated the sacred from the everyday. The sacred was not a department, it was a dimension of everything. The world religions model also had a hierarchy built into it. At the top were the great universal traditions, the ones with texts, founders, defined beliefs, and large populations. At the bottom were the traditions labeled animism or shamanism or indigenous belief, local, oral, untexted, assumed to be simpler, assumed to be earlier stages of something that would eventually develop into something more sophisticated. This hierarchy reflected the colonial context in which it was built. The scholars doing the classifying were from the same cultures that were administering colonial governments over the people whose traditions they were classifying. What this produced was a map of the world's religious traditions that told you a great deal about the mapmakers and somewhat less than it appeared to tell you about the territory. The tradition that has been most dramatically misrepresented by this process is probably the one labeled Hinduism. The word Hindu was originally a geographic term, Persian for the people beyond the Indus River. The diversity of practices, texts, philosophies, and devotional traditions that get grouped under this label is so vast that scholars have argued, with some force, that Hinduism is not a single religion in the way that Christianity or Islam is a single religion. It is an umbrella category covering thousands of local traditions, philosophical schools, devotional movements, and ritual systems that have coexisted, argued, borrowed from each other, and diverged across 4,000 years. Calling it a single religion is roughly like calling all of European culture a single thing. The traditions that have survived best are, unsurprisingly, the ones that were easiest to fit the model. The ones that had clear founding narratives, defined texts, and centralized institutions could present themselves in that Western colonial administrators recognized and therefore extended some protection to. The ones that were oral, local, and non-textual were categorized as superstition, subjected to missionary activity, and in many cases suppressed outright. What was lost in that process is incalculable. not merely the diversity of human approaches to ultimate questions, though that loss is real, but also the specific knowledge embedded in those traditions. Ecological knowledge, medical knowledge, psychological knowledge, social knowledge developed over millennia of people paying close attention to specific places and circumstances. Knowledge that, in several cases, Westerners is now slowly and partially rediscovering through methods that require considerably more expensive equipment. Here is where we have arrived. 60,000 years of human beings doing something with death and transcendence, and the question of what, if anything, lies behind the visible surface of things. 10,000 years of those practices being organized into institutions. 5,000 years of those institutions being used to manage, justify, and contest political power. 2,000 years of the most powerful of those institutions spreading across the planet through mission, conquest, and the simple weight of numbers. Several centuries of those institutions fracturing, reforming, being challenged, and producing the chaotic pluralism of the contemporary world, where more distinct religious traditions exist simultaneously than at any previous point in history. The specific theologies change. The structural argument does not. Every generation faces some version of the same negotiation between the experience of the sacred and the institution that claims to manage access to it, between the founder's vision and the organization that grew up in its shadow, between the comfort that religion offers and the control that institutional religion has historically demanded in exchange for that comfort. The Neanderthal who put flowers on a grave, or maybe just happened to be buried near flowers, we genuinely do not know, was doing something with mortality that no other species appears to do. 60,000 years later, 8 billion people are still doing versions of the same thing. In mosques and megachurches, in meditation halls and ayahuasca ceremonies, in private prayers that no one will ever hear, and in the way some people feel, standing at the edge of something vast. Ocean, mountain, night sky, like something that cannot be named is looking back. Whether that something is real, whether any of the specific claims about it are accurate, whether the institutions built around the experience are more its expression or its distortion, those questions are genuinely open. Smarter people than me have devoted their lives to them without resolution. What is not open is that the questions themselves are human. They are as old as burial sites. They predate cities. They predate agriculture. They will almost certainly outlast the specific institutional forms that currently house them. The origin of religion is the origin of us asking what we are. We have not stopped asking. We are unlikely to stop. And every answer anyone has ever given, every heaven, every reincarnation, every nirvana, every the Tao that can be named, has been both an attempt to answer that question and an invitation to ask it again, more carefully, with more attention to what is actually there. That is not a weakness. That is the work. The story of religion and the story of science are usually told as opposites. But there is a moment in the 17th century when they were the same project run by the same people in the same institutions, and what happened next explains why we think of them as enemies today. That story is wilder and more uncomfortable than either side usually admits. To watch that story, please click the video at the top left. See you there. Thank you.